Hello, and welcome to the To Be Like Christ Bible Study podcast, where we explore and explain the Bible one chapter at a time. My name is Luke, and I am thy host. And today's chapter is Genesis 37. Let's read the chapter together. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version of the Bible. And while I find it in my Bible, if you have a moment, hit the subscribe button on your podcast player so we can study together again sometime. Genesis 37 has 36 verses. Let's go ahead and read. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to them, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I am seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." And the man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we found. Please identify whether it's your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. That is the text of Genesis chapter 37. And as I mentioned at the end of our last study, we are going to be shifting a little bit. We are still going to be talking about Jacob's story because we're talking about his sons, but there will be a little bit of a shift towards focusing on the boys, the 12 sons of Jacob, and specifically one of those sons, and that is Joseph, who in this chapter is being sold out by his other brothers. From chapter 37 really to the end of the book of Genesis, we are going to be focused in on God's work through Joseph and how Joseph is going to change the trajectory of the entire family. So we've talked about a lot of characters in the book of Genesis thus far, but really Joseph is going to carry us pretty much to the end of Genesis, and then we'll pick up anew with a new set of individuals, historical figures, as the book of Exodus starts. Before we get into our study today, let me encourage you, as I always do, to download our PDF that has all the key details on it. It's free on our website. You can also get all 50 chapters of the book of Genesis and their outlines in our book on Amazon, if you would like that. So those links are down in the description. You can avail yourselves of either option. And we're pretty much just going to hop right into the first couple sections of our PDF today because there's not a whole lot of context to go over. We really are, in a way, starting kind of a new story. We've talked about Jacob finally returning to the land of Canaan, where God has promised to make him into a great nation and to give his descendants this land of Canaan. We talked in the last chapter about Esau's descendants, how he lives in Seir, or down in the region that will become known as Edom, and he makes his home down there. But that's really the last time that the scriptures are really going to focus in on Esau. We're focused on Jacob's family now. And now we begin to shift, as I mentioned, from a focus on Jacob himself to a lot of focus being given to his sons and specifically Joseph. So that's the context. And when you break down the book of Genesis into kind of its major sections, this really is kind of the beginning of the final section, the story of Joseph. So you can think about it that way. So let's talk timeline as we get started today. Joseph was 17 when his brothers sold him into slavery in Egypt. This chapter is a little bit unique because we have an exact age for Joseph. We've had some of those in the beginning, but we've kind of been without those specific ages for a couple chapters now. But we do know Joseph is 17 years old when his brothers sell him into slavery. That would be approximately 1728 BC. Although Isaac's death was recorded in Genesis 35, he's actually still alive when Joseph went to Egypt, which is an interesting detail that you only find out if you go through and work through this whole timeline thing. He dies in approximately 1716 BC. For main characters, we pretty much have the family of Jacob. Jacob is the son of Isaac and the grandson of Abraham. And you remember, God changed his name from Jacob to Israel, and you'll see him referred to as Israel in this chapter. Joseph is our second main character. This is Jacob's son with Rachel. He was Jacob's favorite son because the text says he was the son of his old age, and so he's born in his older years. I suspect his favoritism also had something to do with the fact that he was the son of Rachel, the firstborn of Rachel, who was Jacob's favorite wife. And then our last group of characters is Joseph's other brothers. Jacob had 11 sons besides Joseph. Benjamin, at this time period, seems to be very, very young still. He was the second son of Rachel. The other brothers were named Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. Now we must discuss our geography and talk about our map, which I know is everyone's favorite part. If you get the PDF off of the internet, you can see our custom-made map that displays all of these particular locations that we're going to talk about. I know that me describing them to you over audio is not always the most clear, not always the most helpful, so definitely download the PDF. According to verse 14, Jacob's camp was in Hebron. We've talked about Hebron quite a bit, in the valley of Hebron specifically. It's just to the southwest of the city, what would become the city of Jerusalem, and due west of the Dead Sea. Joseph's brothers were pasturing Jacob's flock in Dothan. Dothan is up north in the land of Canaan. And then we're told that Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt. We've talked about Egypt before when we talked about Abraham and Isaac. Remember, Abraham goes down into Egypt and he lies to Pharaoh about Sarah being his sister instead of his wife. So we haven't talked about Egypt in a while, but Joseph is going to go down into Egypt, and we're going to be talking about Egypt a lot more in the upcoming chapters of the Bible and into the book of Exodus. So you'll see on the map that Egypt is, when you have to wrap all the way around the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea to get to Egypt, and it's marked, of course, by the Nile River, a very significant river in that region of the world. I do not have this on my outline, but I just looked it up for you. How far is Egypt from Canaan? It's about 450 to 500 miles away. So Jacob, you remember, he went about 500 miles to the north to go up to Haran. Now Joseph is going to make a trip against his will, being sold into Egypt about 500 miles to the southwest of Canaan. With those first three sections now covered, we can get into our outline, get into the text and break it down and make sure that we comprehend what we just read and cover some key details that we don't want to forget, because we want to lay a good solid foundation on which to build Joseph's story out. So it's important that we get this first chapter down and we understand what we're reading. The first section today of our 36 total verses is verses 1 through 4. This is, I've entitled it, an introduction to Joseph. The chapter opens by reintroducing Joseph to us. This technically isn't the first time that we've been introduced to him. We've been told about him before because he's the son of Rachel, but here's the first time we read any real details about him. He is Jacob's favorite son, and in the opening verses of chapter 37 in our story today, he's 17 years old. Joseph's brothers, we're told, hate him because he's their father's favorite. And we also read that he kind of reported to his father about the work that his brothers were doing. So his brothers were keeping Jacob's flocks, and on occasion he would bring back a bad report. The end of verse 2 says, "And Joseph brought back a bad report of them to their father." Anytime your younger brother is going to snitch on the bad work that you've done, it's probably not going to win you a lot of brownie points. Snitches get stitches, as the saying goes, and Joseph is snitching on his brother's poor shepherding performance, I guess. We also see that Jacob had a custom robe made for Joseph, a robe of many colors. So this was obviously a special gift that not all of his other brothers received. And some people also suggest that this would have only been worn probably by somebody who didn't do a lot of manual labor. Could have been the case that Jacob kind of got all the easy jobs, or he had it easier. His father always gave him the preference, and his other brothers were the ones who had to do the hard work. So all of these things kind of stack up to Joseph's brothers hating him. And what we see here is a repeating of the pattern that we saw with Jacob and Esau. There was a lot of strife in Isaac and Rebekah's house because they had different favorite children. And now we see Jacob really seems like making the same mistake and causing a lot of strife within his family because he's kind of chosen Joseph as his favorite, and he doesn't really seem to be hiding it all that much. But let's now go to section number 2 and talk about another reason that Joseph's brothers hate him. Joseph's dreams, verses 5 through 11. One day, Joseph had a dream which he recounted to his brothers. He dreamed that they were binding sheaves in the field, or they're gathering up the harvest, and his bundle stood upright while his brothers' sheaves bowed down to his. His brothers heard this and they hated him even more after he told them this dream. Like, there's plenty of brothers who are older than you, and you act like we're going to bow down to you. Is that really what you want us to conclude from your dream? Joseph dreamed a second dream, and he also told it to his brothers. Maybe he should have just kept it to himself. But in this second dream, the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed down to him. And Jacob, his father, after hearing this, he even rebukes Joseph for saying this. He says, quote, "Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" Jacob rebukes him for this, but we're also told that Jacob stored this away in the back of his mind. He kept it in mind. And indeed, what we're going to see is that these dreams are actually prophetic. Now, I won't spoil the story and tell you how they're prophetic, but you should also store these away in your mind. Joseph's brothers and even his parents coming bowing down before him. Right? Keep that in mind for what's coming in the upcoming chapters, and you'll see eventually as the story unfolds how those are prophetic dreams. And then we have our third section, verses 12 through 36. Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery. Jacob sent Joseph one day to check on his brothers who were pasturing his flock. They were supposed to be near Shechem, but when Joseph got to Shechem, he couldn't find them, and he asks this man about them, and the man says, oh, they went to Dothan. So he goes up north to Dothan, and he finds them there, and as he's approaching them, his brothers plotted to kill him. Which kind of is shocking, I guess, in the text. It's like, it's one thing to dislike your brother. It's another thing to plot to kill your brother when he's approaching you, just because he had the audacity to show his face at his father's bidding. So they really, really hated him. Reuben, though, who, remember, he is the oldest son, he convinces them not to harm him, but to throw him into a pit. And Reuben was planning to then return to save Joseph from the pit and return him to his father. So Reuben seems like he doesn't want to stand up to his brothers entirely. He says, let's not kill him, but rather than saying that they shouldn't throw him in the pit, he kind of goes along with the pit idea, but his plan is that, well, I'll come back and save him later. So the brothers agree to this. They're like, fine, we won't kill him, throw him in the pit. The brothers seize him, they take his coat, and they throw him in a pit. And it says that there's no water in the pit, so he's not going to be able to live down there for too long. After they throw him in the pit, the brothers sit down and eat. A while later, when Reuben is gone, we're not told where he goes, but he's gone, Joseph's other brothers decide that they are going to sell him to a passing caravan of Ishmaelites who are headed to Egypt. So I believe it's Judah here who says, hey, if we killed our brother, or we had to hide his body or something, like we wouldn't get anything for that. And, our hands would be bloody, both figuratively and non-figuratively, I guess. So he says, that's not any profit to us. How about we sell him to these slave traders and hey, at least we can make some money. And so that's what they decide to do. They bring him up out of the pit and they sell him to this caravan of Ishmaelites who are headed to Egypt. And they sell Joseph for 20 shekels of silver, which from what I understand is not really a ton of money. They weren't making massive profit off of him or anything like that, but it just shows how little they actually liked their brother. Could I sell my younger brother into slavery? There've probably been some days when I might get close, but I don't think I've ever gotten to the point where I was plotting murder or would actually be willing to sell him. Although I would certainly threaten to do so, especially on days when he annoys me. But can't say that I've ever disliked either of my brothers quite this much that I remember, at least. It's easy to say that now when we don't live in the same household. But anyway, I digress. So they've now sold him to the Ishmaelites. He's out of the picture. Now they have to tell their father something. In order to deceive their father about Joseph's true fate, the brothers killed a goat and dipped the robe of many colors into its blood. And then they bring it to their father. And they just kind of allow him to believe that Joseph had been attacked by a wild animal. We don't see in the text that they say that specifically, but this is the assumption of Jacob when he receives the robe, like, he was traveling on the road and some wild animal, jumped out and got him and tore him to bits. And this is all that's left of him, this bloody robe. And so that's what Jacob concludes. And Jacob goes into this period of mourning where he puts on sackcloth and he mourns for many days. And Jacob's sons and his daughters, they all try to comfort him, but he just can't be consoled. And we're told at the end of the chapter that Joseph was sold as a slave in Egypt to a man named Potiphar. And Potiphar is an officer of Pharaoh. So we'll talk next about, well, the next time we pick up on Joseph's story, we'll talk about his work in Potiphar's house and how God is with him there in Potiphar's house. And we'll begin the story of how God is going to use Joseph, even though he's in this terrible situation that his brothers have put him in. So that will be for an upcoming study. But as for now, that's our concise as possible summary of Genesis 37. As we're finishing up our study for today, let's talk about our application, which is always the last section of our PDF. Life may not always be fair, but envy is not the right response. It wasn't fair that Joseph was the favored child, but his 11 brothers couldn't control their father's favoritism. They could only control their response to the reality of it. We can't control the fact that life isn't fair. We can only control the way that we respond to the realities of the world. Envy doesn't solve anything, though, and it's actually listed as one of the works of the flesh, one of these sinful things that people get involved in Galatians chapter 5. It is not a good virtue or a good attitude to have to be envious of somebody else. Although we may not understand why things are the way that they are, we can be confident that God is in control of his world, and all things will be made right in the end. God will see to that, and our confidence needs to be in that, and we need to allow that to dissolve any envy that creeps into our hearts. With that knowledge, we can be at peace in an unfair world. We want to be able to confidently say that, Lord, I don't understand why things are the way that they are. I don't understand why these people get these advantages that I don't get, why they have these privileges that I don't have, but I trust that you're in control of the situation. I trust that the way that you have designed the world and designed me and designed my environment is the best for me, and that you know that. And even though I can't see it, I'm going to trust that that's true. While I may not understand why the world is the way that it is, I trust that you are in control of the world and that you know the answers to those questions. And with that confidence, we can be content in a world that doesn't always make sense to us and that does at times seem very unfair. What we're going to learn in the story of Joseph is that this thing happens to him, which shouldn't have happened to him, and he ends up being sold into slavery. God is going to make all this right in the end. And so we're going to learn this lesson as we go throughout the story of Joseph. And so it's good to follow along in this story if maybe you can't quite make the statement in full faith that you believe that God has set the world up in the best way possible, even though it's unfair. Follow along in the story of Joseph, and you'll see at least one example of how unfair things often turn out to be great blessings in the end, especially when we look at it in terms of the role that we get to play in the plan of God. So that will do it for our study in Genesis 37. I'm excited to uncover and unpack the story of Joseph with you as we go down into the sands of Egypt. Lord willing, tomorrow we will discuss chapter 38. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic, schmantastic day.